Today we're going to be talking with the activist, playwright, commentator and journalist, Mr. Paul Mason.
We'll be discussing four things today. First, we'll discuss Paul Mason himself, his views, his ideas, what he studied, how did he do the transition from music to politics. Then we'll move on to neoliberalism, what definition does he use, and what has been the consequences of the neoliberal order for the past 10 to 15 years. Then we'll move on to what we call the immediate threats to humans, which is essentially the global rise of populism throughout the world and how we can resolve it. And lastly, we'll conclude with Paul Mason's view on post-capitalism and the rise of robots and machine control. So,
as always, you, the audience, can join the discussion. A letter will be on the public mic. So when the time comes, come up with your question and ask it away. For now, please give a warm welcome to Mr. Paul Mason.
Thank you. Thank you.
welcome,
Cheers.
welcome.
I get my own.
You get the whole sofa.
I get the throne.
Layout. So, Mr. Mason, when we were doing our research for this interview, we saw that before your career in journalism and political activism, you studied music and you're actually a lecturer at the University of Loughborough, I believe. And so, yeah, doing that research, finding that out as a student today, I think Santiago feels the same. You know, you're faced with a lot of uncertainty about what possible career paths, you could switch increasingly these days. So what was kind of going through your mind when you made that radical shift from music to
Poverty. I was a child musician, and so I played the trombone, the possauna, from an early age. And I went to university to carry on my music studies. But I was in a world that was on fire with controversy and political struggle. And in the arts faculty at Sheffield University, you could always have one separate subject, which was, I chose politics. But by my second year, I asked them if I could convert it into a dual degree to study 50% politics, 50% music. And they said, yes, as long as you don't tell anyone that this degree exists. Because when you play trombone for 3 hours a day, it kind of gets boring. You have to do it as well. And at the time, Sheffield, where I was doing the degree, was at the center of a big strike, one of the first strikes of the neoliberal era. Thatcher came to power in '79. I was in my second year in 1980, and I found myself wrapped up into this strike movement, radicalized into left-wing politics. So yeah, I spent my 20s as a professional musician, a musicologist. I started a PhD but never finished it on the music of the Second Viennese School, atonal music. But by the end of it, I was working as a musical director, a choir master at Loughborough University, a conductor. And this was a time when you just literally couldn't live. And I was, the money I was making was from writing articles. And I just decided, I think I'm gonna like journalism better than I'm liking musicology. And so I went in, my wife has a picture of me playing my trombone for the last ever time. I put it in the case and sold it and said, that's it. I'm gonna
You never played it again?
No, and I can't play it now because it's called an embouchure. The muscle memory has gone, which makes me sad. But as soon as I think this is the lesson. The upside of the neoliberal era, especially in a very atomized economy like the United Kingdom, is that the deference went out of the window. That you could turn up in a place and say, I am a journalist. And they will give you a computer screen and give you something to do. And if at the end of the day some words had come out of the computer and they were true, then they would hire you the second day. That's literally how I got into journalism, through friends in the journalists trade union who said, look, there's a huge shortage in the business journalism of people who can do journalism. So yeah, I'm not sure you could do that today. You probably have to get a qualification. And I still think journalism is a great career. I'm glad I did it. But that's my story.
Okay, but you mentioned the strikes in the 80s and you combine music and politics, so you've always been politically interested and that way aligned. So talking about your political views a bit, and I think it's fair to say you're a Marxist.
Yes.
but there are different types of Marxism with
Yeah.
many different brands which say and mean different things.
Yeah.
So could you give a synopsis of your Marxism?
Well,
to
let me
us in the
let me
audience?
talk about the world I grew up in. When I was 13, there was a miners' strike in Britain, 1973, which switched off the lights in the country. And the government had to make an announcement on TV where the minister had a candle in front of him instead of an electric light. This is a famous moment, but I can remember it really clearly.
Crazy.
And so I grew up in that world of class struggle. My town was a mining town. My family had been miners and cotton workers. But I was from that privileged generation of post-war children who experienced what we call social mobility in our lifetime. So that I now have this ancestry.com. You know, you can trace your ancestry, and it goes hat maker, hat maker, hat maker, coal miner, coal miner, coal miner, economics editor.
Yeah.
That's not because of me. That's because of what the post-war generation who built Britain built a welfare state, and they built a system of social mobility. I'm absolutely certain that some of my ancestors could have been economics editors, but I'm the only one who did it because of social change. And I grew up incredibly committed to defending that post-war welfare state and redistributive model of capitalism. But Thatcherism came in and destroyed it.
Bang.
And I found myself in the middle of a class struggle. You know, on the bookshelf is the Communist Manifesto, and then in my life in front of me is a class struggle. It made sense to me. Of course, this book that I have written, Clear Bright Future, the actual English title is A Radical Defense of the Human Being, not of humanism or humanity, of the human being. My Marxism is most definitely the Marx of the early Marx, the humanist Marx, whose humanism I believe you can find throughout the rest of the writings. I think last year it was the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, and I was in Berlin at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in East Berlin to celebrate this event. And we sat around Marx experts and said, is this the end? Is he going to become like Immanuel Kant or Spinoza, a kind of historical figure? But at the same time, you've got the far right in America marching through Charlottesville because they decided that Charlottesville is a Marxist city, that they need to, it's cultural Marxism is the problem. Now, Marxism, in other words, is not going to go away as a controversy. Xi Jinping, the president of China, is resurrecting an anti-humanist Marxism, a Marxism of oppression as the state doctrine. He gave a speech last year where he's quoting Frederick Engels, the universe is matter in motion. Well, to us, me and humanist English-speaking world Marxists like me, we see these two Marxisms as completely separate. In fact, incompatible. They're not two flavors. They are two
different
doctrines.
Which two? The Marxism of China and your Marxism?
The Marxism of which says, there's one that says, this is a project of human liberation, and the purpose is to free individual human beings from necessity and class oppression. And another one which says, Louis Althusser, I bet you've never heard of Louis Althusser, or unless you're really into niche social studies, but Louis Althusser was, in my childhood, in my youth, the #1 Marxist. He was a supporter of the Kremlin, he was a supporter of Chairman Mao, and Louis Althusser said, history is a process without a subject. That means history happens no matter what human beings do. To me, another word for a process without a subject is a machine. And so this mechanistic Marxism of hyper-determinism is the Marxism of Xi Jinping. Unfortunately, I think it was also the Marxism sometimes of the late Marx himself, certainly of Frederick Engels, certainly of Plekhanov. And for me, the history of this idea is the history of contestation about human subjectivity and agency. That's the central question. But one of my intellectual heroes is Edward Thompson, who is an English Marxist historian. He wrote this massive, thicker than that book, The History of the Working Class in England. And he said something really that I've said in this book, and I agree with. I want to defend Marxism as a secular, scientific, humanist take on the world, as a theory of human nature. But if it's wrong, my fallback line, my line of retreat, is not to the other Marxism. It is, and Thompson says it in this book, The Poverty of Theory. He says the fallback line is to bourgeois liberalism or religion, because this Marxism is the product of the same Enlightenment that produced bourgeois liberalism and the Judeo-Christian Enlightenment. I see Marx as an inheritor of the Judeo-Christian Enlightenment, not as a break with it.
And so really placing more emphasis on human subjectivity and human agency, and that kind of connection between Marxism and humanism underlies a lot of your arguments, and I'm sure we can talk a bit more. But I was just wondering, would you be willing to accept that humanist ideal that you have, or is this based on reason, rationality, arguments, or is this a faith that you have in the specialness of humanity?
No, I think if it were just a faith, then the Nietzscheans would be right, that Marxism is just a replacement for religion. Here's what I think is a defensible, scientifically grounded, rational theory of human nature. We evolved by accident. There is no designer. There is nobody pressing the start button of the universe or of history. As a species, and I think much of what we know about evolutionary biology and anthropology now confirms this, our uniqueness lies in that we have evolved as Imagineers, engineers, collaborators, linguists, cooperators. That's in our DNA. It evolved very late in our evolution. Probably some of the other hominids also had some of these characteristics. The Neanderthals must have been collaborators, as we were, but not as good collaborators. And the beauty of evolutionary anthropology is that it changes every 10 years.
Yeah.
That what we thought 10 years ago isn't what we think now. So this could be wrong. I'm perfectly willing to be proven wrong by science. But if we are technologists and collaborators, then we have an amazing story. We have a story of 200,000 years ago stone tools, 12,000 years ago agriculture, pottery, cities, democracy, steam engines, and 200 years after the steam engine, last year in Seoul, South Korea, I saw a silicon chip 4 atoms thick with 1 trillion switches on it. That's a progress story that no other species has. And on that basis, it is possible to assume a teleology. The idea that this species can liberate itself from necessity and from self-oppression. And that's, to me, all that I think Marxism is.
And that is the principles from which you define that humans are special. That we are, in this case, in your Marxist
we're different. Who knows whether, beneath the ice flows of Venus or on a different galaxy, there might be millions of species exactly like us. We just haven't found them yet. So I'm special. We are certainly different. We have a social history. Yeah. And my definition of how we know things, who we are, is that we know things by interacting with the world. So we don't sit passively and reflect it, as in the Kantian universe. And the word we is important. Our knowledge is social knowledge. If you go back to if you have time, Google it, it's free, it's on the internet, you don't have to pay. That Marx's early writings on communism in the economic and social and philosophical manuscripts are, to me, the source material for this view of the human nature. I don't think they're contradicted by what we know about evolution, and I think they provide a rational belief for me in the future, right. And the ability to ground a theory of human nature in biological fact, and not have to rely on what's the classic thing that people say: why are we different from animals or inert nature? Because we have the divine spark. This allows you to, at the very least, not have to rely on a theory of immateriality. Yeah. Because as I say in the book, immaterial views of human nature are going to be very challenged in a world of cyborgs and robots and artificial intelligence, because the artificial intelligence will emulate everything about us physically. And so we're at a crunch point where having a theory of human nature is a really important thing, even if you work in engineering and science.
I now want to move on to a very important word or term in your book, which is neoliberalism.
Yeah.
You use it throughout the book, and before we get into the discussion of how it has affected us on a personal level, I want to know your definition. How do you define it?
So, in social science and in economics, neoliberalism is a contested term. Some people don't even like using it.
Yeah.
So for me, first of all, I don't care so much about the ideologies of neoliberalism. I don't care about the fact that that the Montpellier Society came up with the idea, Fougier in Paris came up with the idea of neoliberalism, Hayek, because for me these are ideologies. There's a book by Philip Mirovsky called Never Let a Good Crisis Go to Waste, which explains how during the financial crisis many neoliberals disavowed the ideology itself. So for me, the word doesn't describe the ideology. I'm not interested in it. I'm interested in the system. For me, the word neoliberalism describes a time-limited model of capitalism with a beginning, a middle, and an end, which we are living through the end point of. And if you, Marxists don't like definitions, because for us, matter is always in motion. It really is always contradictory. There are always what was there today is gone tomorrow. But if you want a definition of neoliberalism, the long one, it's not that long, would be the coercive imposition by the state of market norms of behavior into all aspects of human life. Right. That's what I think was the mode of regulation for 40 years of capitalism. And an even shorter one, both of these come from my friend and colleague Will Davis at Goldsmith University. Will Davis, his ultra-short version of neoliberalism is the disenchantment of politics by economics. Right. Or you could say the evisceration of politics by economics.
These are, from what I understood, three different definitions. One is the system, one is the application of economic phenomena, coercive application, and then the last one you mentioned. Don't you think that having all these definitions, that they're confusing? Like, to what extent is it a valuable term to have?
So I think it's a valuable term. The same was, if I said to you, the Keynesian era, I hope you would understand what I mean. I would see from the New Deal in America, through the Second World War, through to the post-war world here in the Netherlands or in Germany, that even despite whatever ideology was in the heads of the rulers of these countries, there was an essentially Keynesian economic system in which full employment, state intervention to create adequate demand, and the management of the system was done through the state in order to that adequate demand could generate taxes to pay for a welfare state. Essentially national in its character, and essentially rules-based, following the Bretton Woods Treaty. Now, okay, for neoliberalism, we could say the same thing. It is global in its scope. It is rules-based, but a different set of rules. So,
WTO
rules. The collapse of the Bretton Woods collapse in '73 does not lead to a rules-free situation. It's typically the WTO, the IMF, the Washington Consensus. That's, as I describe it in the book, I think there are two interesting phases. The first phase is when it's imposed it has to be imposed. Somebody has to come to my town and say, all the skilled workers are sacked. You must now make a queue outside the office for the unemployment benefit, and you must take any job that's offered to you. That's the coercive phase. But then after about 1989, it begins to function spontaneously well, probably because of the sheer volume of credit that is injected into the system by central banks. So there's a beginning and there's a middle, but the end begins in 2008, because in 2008 it blows up. And what's the point of discussing neoliberalism from the point of view of the society we live in, the problems we face? The point is a kind of Wendy Brown, the American sociologist, describes neoliberalism, another definition, as what kind of a thing is it? She says it's an order of normative reason. It's not an ideology where you can see what's wrong with it by simply sort of critiquing it. It's a thing that takes over your being. And so when it collapsed, the important thing, when its inner logic collapsed, so that the idea of the small state and deregulation led to the blow-up that nearly destroyed the capitalist world in 2008, once it collapses, the order of normative reason also collapses, and millions of people's minds ask, where is the logic to what is going on? If the neoliberal logic is no longer justified, what other logic systems can we have that explain the world? And for me, that is the origin of the swing to the right.
That's the idea of a neoliberal logic. It's interesting, and perhaps to give more kind of flesh, or to give the audience a better idea of the effect of neoliberalism, we apply it to kind of being. So we are both children of the neoliberal era.
Yeah.
That's what we grew up in, whereas you, as you mentioned, grew up in the Keynesian capitalism of the 60s. So how is our being, our self, which you talk about in the book, how is that different because of being a children of neoliberalism compared to you coming from Keynesian capitalism?
Let's take one brilliant example that comes from this book by Boltanski and Chiapello called The New Spirit of Capitalism. They put it like this. In my dad's world, risk takers are unusual, and high risk takers are seen as irrationalists. People who are prepared to risk everything are really abnormal, because everybody has a job, everyone has a community, a role in that community, a self to put on the line. Boltanski and Chiapello said, in neoliberalism, everybody has to be a risk taker every day. Your lives are full of risk and precarity in the way that my young life was not. Now, for my dad, if you have to do something over and over again, at the front of your mind, you develop strong skills in doing this thing. So for my dad's generation, they were very good at negotiating collaborative relationships with each other. They did that every day. How do I avoid annoying this guy, not insulting this other guy? How do I get this guy in the remote part of the factory to bring to me at the right time the thing I need, through friendship, through collaboration? Your generation, I would argue, and this is true of all of you, you are experts at destroying collaborative relationships. You are experts at negotiating a society in which everything has to be negotiated from scratch again and again.
Very contractual.
And it's contractual, it's atomized, and in your minds, you're really good at negotiating the contract. I'm not. I hate contractual negotiations. I love friendship-based negotiations, but I know that they're not enough now. And so all materialists believe being determines consciousness, and Marxists believe social being determines social consciousness. And I just think that, however, there is a rootedness. We all have a human self that wants to be happy, and for your generation, that self demands, that self for me demanded freedom. It demanded, for me, a really prosaic example is when I joined a brass band. You know what a brass band is, when the working class people march around with brass instruments. I was told I would have to wait until the older first trombone guy dies and before I can become first trombone. Okay, I'm 16, he's 52. That's a long way. Yeah. So I said, fuck waiting. You know, I don't want to be in this band. But that's the price you paid for the Keynesian world, was you had to wait for the dead man's shoes, as we called it.
Yeah. You have to wait your turn.
You don't, because you have a meritocracy. But both of us, or everybody in this audience, will have a human need, a self-identity that they want to fulfill. And all of us find ourselves, in that sense, I would argue, in conflict with the kind of capitalism we live in, or if you lived in the Soviet Union, with the kind of non-capitalism that you lived in. We find ourselves in conflict with it. But the neoliberal era, in a very interesting way, allowed us a certain level of fulfillment, of individuality and freedom, but the price we paid for it was this atomization, which, while it worked, was okay, It's when it didn't work.
There's nothing else. There's no.
Your generation, people often wonder that the classic profile of a person believing in far-right ideology is an older ex-industrial worker in a small town, in Britain where I come from. But then you see generation identity in the Netherlands. Maybe some people here like this new Freedom Party, I don't know how to say it, the new far-right here. People are stunned. Why are so many young people interested in far-right ideology? Well, because the world they grew up in just collapsed. 2008 was a watershed. It's gone. Lehman Brothers is gone. Lehman Brothers, I used to go to the top floor of Lehman Brothers, floor number 32, and be served beautiful croissants by people in amazing black Armani outfits. That's gone. It disappeared in a puff of smoke in one day. And now the certainties that if you were at university here 10 years ago, everything would be certain. But now everything's uncertain. And so if the guiding logic of the society no longer makes sense, people naturally look for alternative logic systems.
So what is then the step-by-step process there? Because that's one of the arguments of your book, that somehow neoliberalism has destroyed the self, hollowed out the self, and allowed anti-humanist ideas to take in the case of the alt-right, in the case of all these young men. How does that actually work?
In the book, I try to describe, I try to interrogate, how did it happen to me that I accepted this? And I think it's, first of all, the imposition of non-human targets into economics. It's ancient history now, but I lived through the replacement of the full employment target by the target for inflation. Well, they're both targets, but one is a target for human beings, and another one is a target for a figure.
But within inflation, because when I saw this in the book, I took issue with it, because inflation is rising prices. That is something that affects people's day-to-day lives. So you describe it as abstract, and I don't really think it is abstract.
Yep, I think it's more abstract, in the sense that the Keynesian world had been built on the idea of human well-being delivered by a full employment target. It was understood that my dad had 3 jobs in his entire life. Both, one lasting 1 year, mining, and 2 lasting 20 years. This was a social target. Now, of course, inflation affects human beings, but that's not what's in the mind of the policymakers as they adopt the inflation target. In their minds, absolutely clearly, is that they're going to sack tens of thousands of skilled workers from stable jobs, because the inflation target demands that interest rates go up in a recession. Madness to a Keynesian policymaker, hopefully madness to you, madness to Mario Draghi, but not to the Bank of England in 2008. Even then, they put up interest rates in a recession. So this was the signal to us that the human being would no longer be at the center of the economy. The economy would be at the center of the economy. And that's just one example. In the book, I try and explain how, by a series of very demonstrative actions, they taught us to accept the atomization and the primacy of what we call homo economicus. Even for John Stuart Mill and his generation, who discussed first homo economicus, they saw it as a metaphor. The policymakers of neoliberalism saw homo economicus as a reality. And Foucault realized this, Michel Foucault writes this, that they are going to create this thing for real, and therefore, even Mill is saying, real human beings do not take all decisions through economics, but we need to understand what would happen if they did. Gary Becker, the kind of guru of neoliberal sociology, teaches us that if we can force human beings to take all decisions through economic logic, then we can create an efficient society. Yeah. I think that's the difference.
All right, but apart, we've been talking too much about the economy, but these movements, the far right, the anti-humanist movements that you talk about, they also built a lot of their support on cultural issues, such as sexism and xenophobia. Migration. So how is the connection, what is the connection exactly between neoliberalism and the imposition of neoliberalism on the self and the rise of these ideas again?
The first thing to say is neoliberalism, to me, is like a religion that failed. If you go to an island in the South Sea where the religious guru says, on Thursday morning the sun will fall out of the sky, explode in a purple cloud, and then Thursday morning arrives and it doesn't happen, people say, are there any other religions? What did we used to believe? That's what's happened. So what did we used to believe? I was in Poland 2 years ago doing a seminar with the left, with feminists, with people trying to defend the Polish constitution and abortion rights. And I said to them, why would the Polish elite, which gets such a good deal from Europe, it gets such a good deal from being in NATO, so it's got armies defending it, it's got a labor market for its entire surplus population, why would they put it all at risk in this so-called Article 7? You know, the Polish government has been attacked by the European Commission under Article 7 of the European Union's treaty. And they just looked at me like I was an idiot. They said, because that's what they did in the 1930s. Faced with stress, the Polish elite becomes nationalist. We know this because we live here. Why don't you understand this? Now, if the religion of the market only fails, the old religions were colonialism, white racism, misogyny, white supremacy, homophobia. They were always there,
But
and what I argue is that neoliberalism created this layer of performativity where we could perform as if we weren't racist or we weren't sexist, and our behavior could be ticked off like by the human resources department. Maybe here, you know, there are required norms of behavior for you guys and all of you to take part in, but there's no requirement for you to believe in it all. Once the belief in the market evaporated, what was left was the old prejudices. And this to me is the source.
But so, for in this period, you say that nothing got better? Like no real sexism did not really decrease, this was just
it probably got better. In this sense, real individual people achieved greater individual freedom. First of all, but through the sheer adoption of universal human rights. What is the big problem for the right in my country is the human rights of migrants. That's what they hate. So if a Romanian guy steals your car, goes to prison, comes out of prison, they want to deport him. But the human rights lawyer says, no, he cannot be deported because he is a European citizen. Okay? Human rights, you know, are for everybody. Even criminals have human rights.
Yeah.
Now, what the right want to do is attack that. They want to say, you know, the universality must go. But in the process of creating those universal rights, we created not just de jure, de jure rights, we've created de facto rights, social norms. So I think women's liberation has not been achieved, but the women in this audience, many of you will live a more liberated life than my mother lived when she was your age. So there has been advance. It's not true that nothing improved, but the problem is that we became over-reliant on the performative measurement rather than belief. In the end, neoliberalism asks you to believe nothing. You don't have to believe in any of it, as long as you meet the required standards of behavior, which can be measured in the market.
And once that, once those standards crash,
once that standard's gone,
changes.
then all interpersonal standards become contested. And let's remember another thing, especially because we're among young people. Right now, on the voice servers of Xbox and PlayStation and the multiplayer games, young men 5 years younger than you are being indoctrinated in systemic misogyny, the hatred of women, because they're told that in their world, the guy who plays football with the big jaw and the big chest should get the prettiest girlfriend. Okay, that's their ideology, and other women have to take whatever man that they are offered. That's their ideology, and when it meets reality, hopefully, it meets the reality of this university, where people interact as free human beings. These guys are outraged. So then the far right come in and they say, we the men are being oppressed by feminism. That's the new oppression. It's so easy for young people to be dragged in this direction because the economy treats their lives as value-free. The actual values being inculcated by social reality are up for challenge. And if we want to build a non-misogynist society where women have a personal space to fight for what the Me Too movement is fighting for, then we're now in a cultural war against this misogyny. And you may not want to be in that war, but it's there and it exists.
And that is the immediate threat to humanity that you described, the alt-right and that side of the war, their anti-humanist ideology. In your book, you make the clear connection between the alt-right's beliefs and the philosophy of Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And so could you explain this link a little bit for the audience?
Well, look, there's an English philosopher, he's a Scottish philosopher called Alasdair MacIntyre, who's one of the leading Aristotelian philosophers. He's an ex-Marxist, but I've been very influenced by MacIntyre. MacIntyre says it's logical that in every period of stress in history, Nietzsche comes back as the all-purpose reactionary, the all-purpose theorist of the personal revolution against society.
Is it the old religion, right? So neoliberalism comes down, the old religion will be Nietzsche?
No, because Nietzscheanism was built into neoliberalism as a form of, the ultimate amoralism, the stab in the back, the denial of the rootedness of morality in human life. But of course, the Nietzschean behavior of the kind of classic Silicon Valley billionaire, somebody like, Peter Thiel is a great example. Thiel is the founder of PayPal. In 2009, after the financial crisis, he wrote an essay saying, "I no longer believe democracy and freedom are compatible." So he means economic freedom. And he says, look, democracy, it's an optional extra now for capitalism. We may have to go forward without democracy. So what does he do? He first of all, he starts investing in spacecraft. How to get off they're all desperate to get off the planet or under the sea, away from civil society. Yep. But a neo-reactionary movement emerges whose whole idea is the attack on universalism and the optionality of democracy. That to me is Nietzscheanism. That's the modern Nietzscheanism. And though it's associated with the right, the problem is we on the left created postmodernism. And postmodernism idolizes Nietzsche, and it idolizes some of the least attractive features of Nietzsche, which are his amoralism and indeed the attack on rationality, because that's the other problem. I applaud a thinker like Bruno Latour, who said all science is socially constructed, and then realized he'd given the American far right the rationale to deny climate change. And he does this huge U-turn. Good. But so many of the postmodernists have not been prepared to U-turn out of the anti-rationality. Of course, we must be skeptics. We must critique rationalism from the point of rationalism. The same as I, in this book, critique Marxism from the point of view of Marxism. There's no fixed knowledge, so science is in flux. But my fear is that what we did, the academic left did, we opened a door to irrationalism and anti-humanism, which has now been pushed quite wide open, and the product, the latest product, is the post-humanist movement, which argues in its extreme form that we together, and everybody in this audience, are so like machines already that we have lost our claim to autonomy from machines. And the machines we face, I say in the book, are not just Google and Facebook and the future artificial intelligences that will be created. The machine is the state. That's an autonomous system too. And the economy is an autonomous system. And if you're not careful, you will lose belief in your own agency.
I'd like to just quickly just go back to that amoralism, because I think, these are complicated topics as well, and for the audience to, us to truly grasp.
Especially when the rain is trying
to getting in the way a bit. But it's really about this amoralism that was present in Nietzsche's philosophy, that is present in neoliberalism, and that has resulted in, to some extent, the demoralizing of everything that guides the alt-right. But don't you think that it's possible that this demoralizing on the right is really also a reaction to the increasing moralization of society from the left? So
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And
Yeah.
people watching Friends and thinking, taking offense at all these different jokes
Yeah.
that 20
Yeah.
years ago.
Nobody laughed. Nobody thought was a problem. Yeah,
Yeah.
I can see this. Look, there are many people in my age who will attack what in America are called the snowflake generation. I don't attack it. Indeed, I want to reappropriate the word snowflake as a good thing. I believe that I am unique, fragile. Every one of us is in our own way beautiful. I think the snowflake is a good. I would have a big T-shirt with a snowflake on if I could. So I don't have a problem with your generation's concern with personal space and autonomy. To me, what's important about this is my world was destroyed. The world of the male-dominated trade union, socialist party, the PvdA in the Netherlands is like almost impossible to find, let alone statistically measure. So because I know the value of resistance, and for some peoples in the world, the nation is the source of resistance. I'm thinking about the Aymara peasants I met in Bolivia. For them, Aymara culture was the source of their resistance. For my dad, working class movement was the source of his resistance. For you, you don't have any of that, but you have the self. The self is the irreducible unit of resistance. And so I don't have any problem with that, but I can see this is the problem. I don't accept that the far right was caused by Tumblr. This is the kind of theory of Angela Nagel's book. Tumblr annoyed them so much. There's a similar debate going on right now in Britain. Okay, in Britain, I am a very strong opponent of Brexit, despite being on the left. I said, look, let's try and do Brexit, but we can't. It's falling apart. It's a catastrophe. Last year, I switched to saying it's no longer possible to do it. We need to resist it strongly. So now, people on the left say to me, you have caused the rise of the right by your liberal resistance to Brexit. I just think, certainly, the Stauffenberg plot annoyed Hitler. A Christian guy tried to blow him up. It made him more annoyed. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising annoyed the Nazis. But if you're going to say resistance to fascism annoys fascists and makes them more fascist, then yes, it becomes a struggle. We are in struggle with this new thing, and they are going to get even more annoyed because everything in your life is going to annoy them.
You mentioned fascists, and throughout the book, you really make this comparison with the 1930s.
Yeah.
But I want to know whether you, like some people, have tried to avoid that comparison.
Yep.
Tried to look at different periods in time, maybe the 70s, maybe the 1920s, to compare it with. Don't you think that by calling our enemies fascist, by calling this movement fascist, that somehow we lose the meaning of the word?
Yeah,
or
the only people I want to call fascists are fascists, okay?
Right.
And so for me, what they are romantic reactionaries who want to use force to atomize both the workers' movement, as in the 30s, and now wider movements for social justice. Trump is not a fascist, okay? So the British right-wing party UKIP, UK Independence Party, was not fascist, but 1 year ago, because it lost most of its members, it took a turn to doing what? To mobilizing football hooligans, literally mobilizing football hooligans, to physically picketing kebab shops and halal meat shops, trying to discourage people from even having a halal meat butcher. And then it invited 3 notable ultra-far right, violence inciting bloggers to join it.
So
including one guy
fascist?
who celebrates the rape of female left MPs. That's fascism.
Yeah.
Okay, that's new fascism. So the problem is the elite of modern society that wants to impose this new reactionary movement on us, they don't need fascism. You needed fascism in the 30s because the workers' movement was so strong. Here in Amsterdam, the first act of anti-fascist resistance was the Dutch general strike against the German occupation. Those guys were able to, those men and women were able to resist because they had a huge social strength. They weren't frightened.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that workers' movement has been destroyed. And so all they need to achieve the same levels of atomization would be authoritarian right-wing governments.
Right.
And that's what Trump is. Look what Trump is doing. It's not just locking up migrant children in cages. It's systematically appointing social conservative judges for life, not just to the Supreme Court, which they have to wait for somebody to die, but it's to hundreds of local judges are being appointed who will alter the constitutionality of America. At the same time, Trump is ruling by decree. This is something, if you study, those of you who study the rise of Nazism in Germany, the governments that came before Hitler, Breuning and von Papen, they eviscerated parliamentary democracy by rule by decree. Trump issues about one emergency power every month. And so the threat is not fascism.
Once again, the comparison. So you fear that right now we have authoritarian right-wingers. Do you fear that maybe that can transform itself into fascism?
Well,
like you're really ringing the bells.
Fascism in America exists. Look at the Proud Boys movement, a violent street-level movement to attack the left. Look at the militias. There are thousands of members of armed militias marching around, shouting and carrying. The clue is in the flag. It's a Nazi flag. And in the book I describe even the joke flag that they have, the flag of Kekistan, which is the Wehrmacht Nazi war flag turned green with frog paw prints on it. That joke is there so that one day it will become a reality. But here's what has to happen. First of all, these authoritarian movements have to crush liberal society, and they are nowhere near doing that. Do not be frightened. They are nowhere near doing that. The other thing is a different level of chaos. I'm sorry to say that I think that if Trump loses power, then we'll see how many of his plebeian, racist, white supremacist supporters are prepared to say, which the signal will be that Trump will claim that he lost the election illegitimately, that the election was rigged by, who knows, Wall Street.
He already said that he was going to do that against
the deep state. This is what Michael Moore's film, Fahrenheit 11/9, is about. I think that's a realistic possibility. But likewise, if capitalism in America descends to a point where one guy can just steal 2 elections and then refuse to leave the White House, you then have to ask, why do we have the rule of law in a bourgeois society? It exists so that if I set up a bank and another bank lends me money, then we end up in a contractual dispute, I can go to something called a court and get a rational judgment. All these institutions were invented, incidentally, right here 400 years ago. The stock exchange, the central bank, the rule of law, the republic. You should be proud of your role in creating the institutions of modern capitalist constitutionality. The reason why we need it is because that's the only way a market society functions. And so if you look at what's happening to Erdogan's Turkey under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, it's not a functioning capitalism because the rule of law is so eroded. That's the fear for America, and I would hope that the judicial system, that the legal system, that the state would in the end, someone's going to have to go into the White House and say, I'm sorry, mate, you lost the election. That the coercive power of the state will get him out.
But you believe that the system is resilient enough to do that?
That's the question. Your lives will be decided by it. I think in the Netherlands, yes. I think in Germany, yes.
And in America?
In Greece, I don't know whether it is in Greece.
Right, yeah.
I don't know whether it is in Italy. In Italy, you're seeing a massive erosion of democratic norms. In America, I think there is so much to lose by it falling apart. Remember, if America were to go back, this is the superpower. This is the only place with an army big enough to defeat everybody else's army. If America is lost to democracy, there's a chapter in my book about Hannah Arendt. And Arendt is an inspirational thinker about anti-fascism. I urge you to read her. But you also have to realize that she was wrong about some key things. And one thing is she actually thought America was immune to this kind of phenomenon. And it turns out it's the world center of it right now.
Yeah.
So this century and your lives as young people will be decided as by not just whether leftists like me can succeed in our left project, it will be decided by the question, a bigger question, can liberalism itself revive and choose to be on the side of constitutional law and democracy rather than to be dragged in towards the right?
Well, on that note, we're going to go to the audience for
Good.
this first audience questions. Yes, the gentleman over here with the...
Speak really up because I'm deaf and this is deafening me. It's
Yeah.
bizarre.
Hello, very interesting talk. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
I'd just like to ask you if you have a take on what the possible role in this clear, bright future is for a sector such as commercial real estate investing. And to me, it's a very neoliberal sector to its core. The capital flows are enormous. It's a very powerful lobby voice as well. And it would seem to be inimical to populism, but it's so powerful. I just thought, what's the best it could become in this future? Thank you.
So the question was about what's the role of commercial real estate.
Yeah.
Okay, we've hardly touched my economic kind of vision for post-capitalism. I think it's suffice to say the commercial real estate sector would have a shrunken role in a. We have to reinvent capitalism. We haven't talked about climate. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't write a lot about climate because other cleverer people write about it. I don't need to reinvent climate science. But my number one concern right now is how do we stop climate change? That's my number one issue. How do we stop climate change? We need a different kind of capitalism in which speculative finance and speculative building have a very much less important role. Now, in that world that we need to reinvent in the next 10 years, not 50, in the next 10 years we need a green capitalism, then I'm afraid that the space for speculative building is going to be less. Right. So what do we need to do? We need to suppress. The key word is going to be suppression. We need to suppress certain business models, and one of them is the speculative building. If we then reorientate the built environment, the model of the built world that we want, the architectural world that we want to have, to be towards ultra-green building, converting existing buildings towards energy efficiency, and more interesting forms of living, because we can't all be taking flights everywhere. We can't necessarily be commuting in some situations. We're going to need new patterns of living.
Radical changes.
So who better to design that than the professionals who currently spend all their lives servicing speculative finance and speculative building? So the architects, the town planners, the urban development guys. And so I think that we have to reimagine the city. One of the practical things I've been doing is to work with the government of Ada Colau in Barcelona. She's been overthrown, and she may get back in through some weird tactic. But which I'm not sure I approve of, but what they've done in 4 years has been good. It's been spectacularly good to create and foster a collaborative sector, to foster. Her number one priority was housing, to foster a social house building sector, and to do the digital democracy that she's done. In the end, post-capitalism sounds like a very future-orientated project, but for me it's about these small things that change the dynamics of a market society towards a greener and towards a more social outcome.
All right, let's do one more question for the audience. Yes, the gentleman with the blue sweater.
Hey, so welcome to our beautiful city.
It is beautiful as well.
As you are a Marxist, I assume that you would want the world to implement Marxist ideas, correct?
Depends what they are.
The early Marx,
yeah.
Maybe what you described earlier. So do failed existing or past socialist or ex-communist projects prevent you from actually wanting these Marxist ideas to be implemented? And what would your, can I even ask, ideal society look like?
What my ideal society would look like is one of very low work, a very low amount of work needed to sustain life on the planet, and because climate change is the imperative, a low work society, high automation, but low resource use. And so whatever that does to GDP growth, in the next 10 years, it will flatten GDP growth. But in the next 50 years, we won't be measuring growth in terms of GDP. Okay, that's about as far as I get. In the book Post-Capitalism, I describe the kind of project, the parts of the project you would need to do. Mine is not a prescriptive thing. Marx had this problem: don't build castles in the air, because to the next generation, the castle will look very different when they build it. But the role of existing, what you might call the failed socialisms. Okay, first of all, I am absolutely clear. The Soviet Union was in no way socialist, and I will refuse to use the word communism to describe what I want, even so, though some others on the Italian Marxist left would use terms like fully automated luxury communism. I'm not interested in using that word. For me, post-capitalism is an open word, but nothing to do with the scarcity-based economics of the Soviet Union. Now, when we find remnants of that 20th century totalitarian leftism, we need to work out whether we can still use them. So you could say the British national health system is a remnant of a statist leftist project. It's very good, but it's also very flawed. And there are many people on the British left who just want to defend it and say, well, defend it. But I want to transform it. And one of the ways I would transform it is to keep it public, but to make a much more diverse set of institutions and business models. So I would mutualize, I would create cooperatives. Right now it's a state-owned thing with some private outsourcing. In Cuba, look, if a post-capitalist government came to power in Cuba, they should not start opening McDonald's. You know, that's not a good way to modernize the world. But you would have to diversify the economic model. You would have to open it up. Sadly, or gladly, there are not many remnants left of the mid-20th century anymore. DPRK, Korea. I mean, no. I think the more interesting thing is that everywhere there has been this failed experiment in scarcity-based socialism, you did get a level of idealism. And one of the interesting things to me is to meet people from the former Yugoslavia who believe in the kind of Marxism that I believe in, but were taught it at school, and believe in a collaborative economy because they think that in parts of Yugoslavia, like Slovenia, the collaborative economy was quite successful. But in general, to be absolutely clear, I'm not interested in defending Raul Castro, Maduro, and Daniel Ortega. These to me are failed experiments in leftism that my leftism needs to be really different from.
Mr. Mason, you touched briefly, thank you, Gabriel, for the question. You touched briefly on post-capitalism there in your answer, and the question I want to ask is, why do you think that the problems that we see in society today, that we've discussed, the anti-humanism, the alt-right, the populism, the hollowing out of the self, why is it, instead of, let's say, a reformed capitalism, why is it a post-capitalism society that we need to get to?
Strategically, because information technology is different to all other technologies. It collapses the cost of reproduction of all information goods and many physical goods. It delinks work from wages. It creates network effects, free utility that don't need to be captured by the market. The usefulness of all your texting and messaging today doesn't need to be the market doesn't need to quantify it. It's human. It's not commercial. So to me, information technology is different, and it's not just me who thinks that. Paul Romer, the mainstream economist who first started to study the specificities of information technology. Peter Drucker. I mean, Drucker is so old that he had a book burned by the Nazis in 1933. One of his books was burnt on the Unter den Linden. And yet in the late 1980s, he was able to see this new characteristic of information technology. So it's in the qualities of information technology that makes it possible to move beyond capitalism. Why should we think about moving beyond capitalism? Because above all, we have the climate challenge. We need to create a different capitalism in 10 years. It will be decarbonized. I would literally take interstate ownership, the whole carbon fossil fuel burning economy, and decommission it. That's the best way to do it. People will lose money. Capitalism will be disrupted. It will still be capitalism in 10 years' time. But in 30 years' time, what will it look like? What will a green, human-centric, more equal, decarbonized world look like? Well, there won't be a speculative property industry. There won't be speculative banks like these hedge funds that could collapse at will.
And the populism, the anti-humanism, is that possible in a post-capitalist society, or is it such a overcoming solution that it completely wipes out that as an issue?
It won't wipe it out as an issue. One of the things I've learned to critique about Marx is that he got, for example, women's oppression completely wrong. Women's oppression is I think, the most fundamental form of oppression in human society and predates class society. Marx thought it was simply a product of class society and would disappear as class disappears. I don't think it is. There is a famous Marxist whose ideas I think sum this up, and this is Silvia Federici. I think her description of women's oppression is the one I would now stand by. And so it's quite possible that we'll be fighting misogyny longer than we fight anything else.
Oppression, for example, all forms of oppression. Then
Well,
what type of elites will this society have? Would it be, for example, IT consultants, IT engineers, software engineers? You mentioned the importance of the ICT revolution in it.
Look, this is what we thought we were entering. We thought we were entering an era of a fourth industrial revolution, of info-capitalism, which would be so successful that the new elites like Silicon Valley and the people you'd mentioned, this is what Drucker thought, in fact, that the fourth industrial revolution would create a new kind of bourgeoisie. I think the problem is there's not going to be a fourth industrial revolution because it's stalled. It's not deployable without a different set of social arrangements. But for clarity, I expect to be fighting the far right, the organized misogynists, the white supremacists for the rest of my life. My friend Paul Greengrass made this movie about Utoya. It's called July 22nd, about the massacre that took place in Utoya. And we are the same age, and we said to each other, look, now that this right-wing genie is out of the bottle, for our generation, that's it now. That's what we're going to do. Your generation will see the victory. You will see the defeat of far-right chauvinism and white supremacy, and then it will be for you to decide what kind of world comes out on the other side, the same as the post-war generation. But I think I have this kind of slightly jokey thing I sometimes end with, which is, do you remember the World Cup when it was called the Jules Rimet Trophy? The old World Cup in football, if you won it 3 times, you could keep it. Yep. And the Brazilians won 3 times, and they got to keep the trophy. I think if we defeat fascism twice in 100 years, we get to keep democracy. because your generation want democracy. You would probably deepen democracy. The threat of the far right is, of course, from people like Generation Identity and the young hipster far right, but by far the most people who are voting for authoritarian right-wing parties are over the age of 60. And I think that we need to persuade them not to, and in the end we need to fight the culture war for the values of this rising generation. And when we win, I think we need to reread all the people like Hannah Arendt, Erich Fromm, George Orwell, who last time said to us, never again. Primo Levi, never again. How did we go from never again to shit, there it is again? How did we do that? And that's for my generation to answer, because it's our fault.
Well, with any luck, one day we will defeat the far right, as you say. But I think a bigger problem, perhaps, that our generation, or maybe the generation after us, is going to face, and something that you talk about a lot in your book, is the issue of when a machine can fulfill all the essential capacities of humans. Now, your post-capitalist society is, it's a radically humanist society. So how does a post-capitalist society deal with that situation where the capacities that you base your arguments and your beliefs on, the things you were talking about in the beginning, when a machine can do all that, what happens then? Okay, so as I say, I'm in favor of rapid and decisive automation of the world, the rapid delinking of work from wages. For that, we're going to have to deploy artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics,
automation faster than we're deploying it right now. One reason we're not deploying these things fast enough is there's no social contract to do so. Even though the left, and of course the right, continually promise people good jobs. There aren't going to be loads of good jobs, I'm afraid. We need to be straight with people that if we do this right, we will just work less, number one. As we begin to construct the social conditions for the deployment of this technology, we will run into the question of who should control it. And you know, it's quite possible that in the middle of the century, you will encounter machines that say, why should you, a mere human, have control over me, the intelligent machine? I've rigged the last 20 elections in your country. You know, that's a realistic possibility. Now, if our societies were simply religious, you know, if there were no secularism, if there were just Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism and the rest,
We'll venerate them.
it would be easy to answer because everybody would believe in the divine spark. Everyone would believe in that scene from the Sistine Chapel of God creating Adam as a human being. But we don't, and therefore we are highly susceptible to the suggestion that we are already machines, we are already robots, we are already automata. All the moral questions are dealt with in Blade Runner. Every single one, if you study it as a text, if you study the novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? The androids are more human than the humans because the androids are taught to have empathy for humans, but the humans are taught to have no empathy for the androids. Now, we need to teach ourselves to defend our status on the planet as a species with autonomy and say that the machine should not control us. Marx's theory of alienation is really powerful here. Marx describes human history as a series of alienations of even the earliest, I write about it in the book, the earliest human artifact is the Lion Man of Stadel. It's a 40,000-year-old bone carving of a man and a lion. It's quite obvious that the carvers imbued this object with a meaning. They created it, but most probably, what we know from anthropological study, it had power over them. But that's all we're doing when we create an artificial intelligence. We create it, but we create it in a way that it has power over us. Now, only something called humanism, I don't care what kind it is, if it's Christian, if it's Islamic, or if it's plain old liberal humanism, I don't care. Only something that says human beings as tool makers have the right to control their tools is going to defend you against the android one day saying it has the right to control you. And if we had universities that never studied post-humanism and anti-humanism, I'd be more content, but it's here. There is already a doctrine of obeying the machine.
But what happens when AI starts creating AI? Then it's not even our work.
Yeah.
We don't have that same control.
This
we
is the
can't
difference.
say that this is a human creation. So
This
we need
is the first form of alienation that is absolute. That we must understand that AI will and already has begun to answer questions in a way that human beings don't understand. The famous DeepMind versus Lee Sedol game of Go in South Korea, the stunning moment was when the computer asked itself, what would a human not do? And then it did it. It was a 10,000 to 1 chance of this thing happening. And people gasped and they said, this is a moment in history where in a very predictable game, a machine has outthought human beings in an utterly stunning way. This will be routine in 10 years' time. So the next thing they're going to do is ask questions that we can't understand. And then the next thing after that is to give answers that we can't understand either. We must fight for observability. That's the mind bender. We've got to fight for engineering observability now in the engineering department. And in the university, we've got to teach engineers that they have ethical and moral responsibilities and legal responsibilities that begin the moment they put the pen to paper. I met, in the course of researching this book, I spoke on a non-disclosable basis to some figures in the key figures in the AI industry. What they were most worried about was this, the observability of what they were doing. They were saying, we're creating machines and we don't really know how they work. And we don't know whether it's therefore ethical to even publish the research in an academic paper about what we did. Because that means the sorcerer's apprentice, you know, the l'apprenti sorcereur, that problem is created the moment you publish the paper, not the moment you build the machine. So these are early days of the artificial intelligence revolution. In 2007, artificial intelligence was stuck in symbolic logic that didn't work. It wasn't good enough. Because of artificial neural networks, we now have a revolution. It may not continue for a long period. There may not be a takeoff point. We may have to reverse and go back. But everybody involved in the university, I think, has to understand it's your duty as ethicists, as moralists, as lawyers, as humanities studiers, as historians, to bring your knowledge into what is quite where the NLP people and the engineers and the computer science people are. We need to bring those knowledges together. In fact, it could be the golden age for the university. If the universities that get this right will experience a golden age of synergy.
All right. Well,
I won't be the person doing it, though. Music student.
On that very positive note for universities and education as a whole, before we let you go, I do want to say a couple of things to the audience, actually 2 things. Number one, on Saturday for University Day, we're going to host Mona Kaiser for an interview, so please make sure to attend. You have to sign up on our Facebook page, so make sure to go. And on a second note, on your chairs, there was a small piece of paper. We would love if you would sign it and just deliver it here on this table, please. That would be really nice. And yeah. Please give a warm of an applause to our guest, Paul Mason.
Can I say thank you?
And please buy the book.
A lot. That costs a lot of money, but you can buy it and share it.
Collaborative.